No one likes to talk about comedy. And the reason is obvious. Nothing ruins a joke more than explaining it. Secondarily, comedy is very famously subjective, a product of taste, historical context, social circumstance, and lived experience. In other words, it's unlikely that you and I share the exact same comedic taste. Worst of all, talking about comedy makes you sound like a complete fucking nerd. Fortunately for this channel, I am a fucking nerd, so we're gonna talk about what makes video games funny. This video is inspired by a classic video essay, Every Frame a Painting's video on Edgar Wright movies and visual comedy. In that video, Tony Zhou critiques the mid-tier American comedy film, arguing that most comedy films don't take advantage of their medium. That is, most comedy films forget that they're films. To use Zhou's words, they're lightly edited improv, where the jokes are entirely in the delivery of the dialogue and not in the composition of the images. Against that trend, Zhou celebrates Edgar Wright's movies as examples of films that deliver jokes through their images and through editing. In other words, movies like Hot Fuzz and The World's End are examples of films that use their medium to create comedy. And Zhou's questions about medium specificity in comedy and the approach of just using a couple of specific examples are guiding my approach to comedy in games in this video. I can't give you an extended history of comedy games. Or I could, but we'd be here for 20 hours, and there are a million idiots on YouTube who will give you that kind of content. Not me. I have a real job. For now. Instead, I want to talk briefly about why video games struggle with comedy and how a couple of forward-thinking indie games have tried to break the medium out of that struggle. I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that there are two main reasons video games struggle with comedy: timing and repetition. A big part of the success of a joke lies in its timing, letting a setup build tension and knowing when to break that tension with the punchline. The problem with an interactive medium is that there's never a guarantee that the players will cooperate with a joke. If there's something funny happening in the game, you can't guarantee that the player is going to be paying attention to it.
Hammerlock would come around eventually. Me and him are like two peas in a pod. Two bullets in a bag. Two cannibal midgets in a fat guy's ribcage.
What's more, you can't compose a joke that relies on timing that is also interactive, unless you are very tightly controlling that interactivity. We like to think of video games as infinite possibility spaces, playgrounds of agency that respond to us in real time. But if we look at what video games actually are, we see that they're pretty rigid. Games are bad improvisers. They have a set series of inputs they respond to, and they want us to behave in particular ways. In other words, their crowd work is dog shit. A video game can't riff on my terrible love life or boring hometown. It can only compose jokes on its own terms. And the greater degree of freedom a player has, the harder it is to tell a joke that relies on timing and control of images. This is why a lot of comedy games simply throw jokes into the mise-en-scène. If a joke is entirely contained on a poster, then you can just hope the player sees it without interfering with their freedom. This is also why a lot of comedy games reproduce the problem that Zhou identifies in comedy cinema. The jokes are delivered entirely through dialogue, either ignoring the medium or outright resisting it.
Along with the CIDs, Zen are transporting a prototype for a contained forced recursive feedback projector.
That sounds like complete bullshit, even coming from you.
And this brings us to the other problem that games innately have with comedy: repetition. Most video games, or at least video games that want to give you a challenge, are built on repetition. They give players a set of tasks to perform over and over again, testing the player's skill at performing such and such an activity. What this means for joke delivery is that you have the same setup for a joke over and over again. How do you deal with that if you're trying to make a game that is traditionally challenging, with positive feedback loops of rewards for skillful play, while also delivering jokes during gameplay? How do you keep making jokes out of shooting people when you're 10 hours deep into the same gameplay loop? Well, the two solutions we tend to see are contextual quips, which both get very repetitive very quickly, either because we're literally hearing the same jokes over and over again, or variations on the same joke over and over again.
I am awesome! I'm still standing! Feel I win.
Or we get dialogue that is layered over the gameplay, where the activity of the player is incidental to what is being said.
Think the whole White House was destroyed?
I don't know. Maybe. Why?
I was thinking if it was, we could get Ultor to rebuild it. You know, add more defenses, more weapons, a few underground jet hangars.
Are you serious?
Hell, maybe in a few more stripper poles in the bedrooms.
More? You already had some stripper poles?
I had one installed like the first day I was in office.
Wow.
Are we sure buying guns is something I'm allowed to do here?
This is the video game equivalent of the lightly edited improv approach to film comedy. The jokes might be fine, but the medium is being ignored or actively resisted in the joke's telling. I don't think it's too much of a leap from here to posit that most gameplay loops, or at least those that are common in AAA game design, are antithetical to comedy. That is to say, structures of challenge and reward resist comedy. And that might explain something about why most comedy video games are the way they are. Most comedy games are not difficult, or at least not demanding in terms of coordination and reflexes. Think about the classic LucasArts adventure games, which are funny, but don't put you in a position where you're being subjected against your will to the same jokes over and over, because you're solving puzzles and you're never at risk of dying.
I think I'd just like to browse.
Whatever.
The two games we're going to focus on in the back half of this video, Jazz Punk and Thank Goodness You're Here, are basically challenge-free. Comedy games, or games that are incidentally comedic, that are also difficult, tend to derive their comedy directly from their difficulty. Think of Octodad and Quap, two games whose slapstick comedy derives from being given control over a body that is hard to control, that flails and fails to do what you want. Failure is, I think, very key to understanding how comedy in video games might work. The now fairly mainstream idea that games like IO's recent episodic reboot of the Hitman series,
Smell good, Mr. Kruger.
and From Software's Soulsborne games, are at least partially comedy games, derives from the fact that these games let you fail spectacularly, and they make failure occasionally very fun and funny to watch.
He's behind you now.
In his treatise on laughter in the comic, philosopher Henri Bergson begins by describing the archetypal funny scene of a man tripping and falling over. If you don't know, Henri Bergson is the father of the philosophical movement of phenomenology, which is the study of how our mind organizes sensory data from the external world into conscious experience. And if that doesn't sound like a guy who knows comedy, then, well, how do you explain this hilarious bit where he theorizes the funniest physiognomies? It's like a post-ironic Cumtown bit 100 years before its time, and... wait. Holy fuck, I think he's serious. Ignoring the weird phrenological racist stuff, I do think Bergson's description of why a dude tripping and falling is funny is genuinely useful for understanding how comedy can function in video games. For Bergson, the humor of a man tripping and falling is derived from the man's rigidity. In other words, when you're walking along and you encounter an obstacle, the expectation is that you would exercise your will and your innate flexibility to avoid the obstacle. When you hit the obstacle, it's because your body was too overtaken by the automatic, habitual activity of walking. You weren't flexible enough to avoid the obstacle, you were too rigid. Bergson goes on to explain that humor derives from moments where our attention is called to the human body at the expense of the intellect or the soul. In these moments, the body appears to take on mechanical or machine-like qualities. The body is no longer a perfect extension of the soul, what we could call our intentional will or our agency. Instead, in these moments of rigidity, the body is a fallible machine which is subject to its own automatic mechanical whims. So, for Bergson, comedy derives from moments where the body is too rigid to adjust to its surroundings in the way that it ought to. and in these moments, the body takes on qualities of a machine. So, failure is one kind of event in a video game that results from the player being too rigid. A game gives you a task or throws you some kind of curveball to respond to, and you don't respond well enough, and you die. If that moment is funny, Bergson would say it's funny because the player was too rigid to adapt to their surroundings, and that rigidity is rewarded with some kind of comedic flattening, or a flubbed assassination, or some kind of other spectacle that results from the player's desires being misaligned with what their body has actually done.
If you take cover behind that corner, you can totally just throw it in her face.
Oh my god, just throw it in her
Fucking
face.
God, just do it, throw it, throw it! LT. Dude, she's gonna see you. What are you doing?
I can't bear it.
What are you doing?
Oh,
Throw it! You need to throw.
Get it!
Nailed it.
And in these moments, we become aware of the player's body and the video game as a machine. No longer are we a warrior or a master assassin, we're a dork at a computer who fucked up. But failure in games isn't always funny. Often it's not funny at all. If you're the person playing, it's frequently infuriating. So when is failure funny and when is it annoying? Well, let me pose a theory. I've been playing a lot of horror games lately, and what I've noticed is that jump scares in games almost work the same as jokes in games do. In a good horror game, like the Silent Hill 2 remake, a large part of the horror atmosphere derives from the real tension of losing your progress. You haven't saved your game for 30 minutes, and so you feel tense, gazing into shadows, rotating the camera, because you're afraid some monster will jump out at you and erase the last half hour of gameplay by killing you. So, when a monster goes ooga booga, it's frightening. But it's also kind of a release. The tension of anticipation is broken, and you start flailing around in response to the sudden challenge. And in this way, a jump scare functions like a punchline. It's a cathartic release from the tension of the setup. But a jump scare only becomes funny when your time and progress aren't at risk. In other words, a jump scare is funny when it happens to someone else. Bergson even suggests something like this when he says that comedy is aesthetic, by which he means it requires a certain separation from direct personal or emotional investment. Quote, "The comic comes into being just when society and the individual, freed from the worry of self-preservation, begin to regard themselves as works of art." Unquote. What is a Twitch stream, if not the transformation of a video game into a broadcast work of art designed to be viewed?
Oh boy, I hope nothing fucking freaky and fucked up.
The whole industry of video game streaming more or less owes itself to people willing to scare themselves on camera for the viewer's amusement. The intimate relationship between failure, horror, and comedy is basically the core of an entire sphere of entertainment. Or at least it was 10 years ago when this was getting started and people were just streaming like Slender or whatever. But something we shouldn't lose sight of is that Bergson's principle of rigidity applies to jump scares too. Jump scares are funny because the person being scared wasn't able to flexibly react to the thing that leapt out at them.
I think I did something wrong.
Similarly, a failed jump scare is funny because we can see the mechanism of it. The game is too rigid, too deliberate, too machine-like in its design to anticipate the player's canniness. But both of these cases share a flaw. They're funny unintentionally, or they're funny as a byproduct of a movement between mediums. So, how might a video game stage a joke with a punchline that doesn't rely on an unintended or exceptional failure? Well, I still think the principle of rigidity helps us find the answer. Here's one of my favorite jokes in video games, from the indie comedy game Jazzpunk. Please know it's not going to be funny to you because I'm explaining it. So, Jazzpunk is a farcical spy fiction game, and in this scene, you're meeting your new handler. You walk into his office and...
Please, have a seat. We've much business to discuss. Basically, we need you to infiltrate the Soviet consulate.
The joke here isn't the fart sound, it's the inevitability of the fart sound. The cushion is there, openly visible, but you can't do anything about it. You don't have the agency to sit elsewhere, to move the whoopee cushion. You have no choice but to take a seat where the game makes you take a seat. The joke is about your lack of control. It's calling attention to the limits of your agency. To put it another way, it's that your control of your character is too rigid to avoid the whoopee cushion. Another newer indie comedy, Thank Goodness You're Here, opens with a very similar gag. Your character is tasked by his boss to go visit the mayor, and to do that, you need to leave the office. This room functions as a bit of a tutorial, where you learn that you can smack things, jump, and push stuff. So you smack the water cooler, push the tank to the window, and jump out the window, to which the boss replies, in horror,
"Good grief, lad, the front door's right there. We're 10 stories up, for crying out loud."
This is yet another joke that derives from the rigidity of your control over your character. Any sensible person would walk out the door like your boss suggests, but the game doesn't let you do that. Based on your limited control of your character, jumping out of the window is the sensible choice, the logical choice, that emerges from the rigidity of your agency over your character. And the punchline is the absurdity of how the game's rigid control scheme makes us think. Both Jazzpunk and Thank Goodness You're Here open with these jokes predicated on a lack of player agency, and in both games these jokes act like something of a thesis statement, or a promise. We're going to make you laugh by calling attention to how little control you have. Most of Jazzpunk's jokes are predicated on the unpredictability of its interactions. When you hit A to contextually interact with an object, you think you're going to do something innocuous like picking it up, but sometimes... The comedy is predicated on how little control you have over the environment. I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but the rigidity of how you interact with the environment gives the game room to play with your expectations. Your lack of freedom in how you manipulate the surroundings is the framework of a bunch of unexpected gags.
Everything sounds like... Oh, that feels weird.
Thank Goodness You're Here plays with rigidity in a different way. The game makes you repetitively run routes through the town, leading to repeated gags that develop each time.
Ah, a fine mess. Don't bother there, young man. Help yourself to some scrambled bread on your way out. Ah, hello again. Didn't expect to see you twice in one day. Go! Oh, you little dusty gentleman, you.
The restrictive, repetitive nature of video games is mined for comedy. Here, the rigid and mechanistic nature of games is the basis of the jokes.
Heavens to beetroot! I need to get that fixed.
And we can see rigidity operating as a principle of humor in other games as well. I was mean to Saints Row 4 earlier, but to its credit, when the game limits your control and transforms its gameplay, it can be very funny. Disco Elysium takes the implied rigidity and gracelessness of failing a skill check and makes that a source of comedy. You have to live with failure and own up to saying things like, "I want to have fuck with you."
What was that?
And again, when a body is rigid, it begins to take on qualities of a machine. That is to say, when we fuck up, when we are insufficiently elastic to not trip and fall in real life, our body is not an extension of our will, but a fallible mechanism. And when we fail, or when a game fails, it works the same way. Our immersion in the world is broken, and our attention is called to the mechanics and the rule set and the physical machine we're interacting with. We can suddenly see the strings, if you will. And moments where we suddenly become aware of the mechanism of the video game are the basis of an entire subgenre of video game physical comedy. Glitch videos, weird physics bugs, and other strange moments where video game bodies begin to behave in ways they shouldn't. These are videos where the mechanism of the video game peeks its head through the narrative space, and we laugh, watching bodies we're supposed to believe in act like machines. And the reason I'm so preoccupied with Jazzpunk and Thank Goodness You're Here is that they're both games that explicitly thematize this mechanization of the body. Jazzpunk is a cyberpunk game that constantly plays with the physicality of a video game body. You interact with a clock using your hand just to pull away and realize you're holding a cutout. You jack into an ATM using cyber arms, and you discover the cyber arms were never attached to you. You seem to exist in a nested series of simulations, a digital world that is only ever half real. Thank Goodness You're Here ends with a big musical number where your character is overwhelmed by the insistent demands of the needy townsfolk, where you are compelled to perform a chaotic series of tasks set to an ever-increasing rhythm.
I'm in distress. I just can't see with all this mess.
The beat reinforces your character's mechanization and how overwhelmed he is. The lack of control he seems to feel at the mercy of a bunch of strange British people is the point. This is all to say that Jazzpunk and Thank Goodness You're Here are exemplary comedy games because they seem to get something about how comedy can work in video games. This is not to say they're perfect. As we said at the top, comedy's very subjective, but to be totally honest, the biggest laughs in Thank Goodness You're Here are in the cutscenes.
My beautiful baby boy. And bigger than I thought.
Father? Father?
Despite that, these are forward-thinking games that seem to get, if you want to get a laugh, confront your player with the limits of their agency. Bring them to the rigidity of the machine.
I'm so thirsty. Oh, it's so thick and creamy. This is really delicious. You're amazing. You're a great drink maker person. Thank you so much. You're a peach. Oh, there's a blonde hair in it.